Can you tell us why the movie Ordinary People was a defining moment in your life?
I think when I saw Ordinary People, I was about 17 years old, and it was the first really serious movie I had seen, after Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And it also really spoke to who I was as a kid. I was kind of a socially awkward, lonely kid. And so I felt, whatever discomfort went with that. And Ordinary People showed this main character who looked on the outside like he had everything together and like he didn't experience the kind of pain that I experienced. But then the film, because it's a beautifully told story, reveals his secret life. And in his secret life, he's actually just come out of treatment after a suicide attempt. And he's going to high school, he's singing in the choir. He looks to everyone like he's one of the ones who's really got it all together. And for the first time, as I sat in the audience, I realized, oh, it's possible that what's on the surface isn't what's really going on underneath. That's, I guess, something adults know. I didn't know that as a 17-year-old. And so that film showed me that I wasn't the only one. So that was the first thing that made a huge difference to me. And then the second thing was I realized, oh, so the people around me might actually be in pain, even though it's not obvious. I need to treat people differently. And that is something that has continued to shape me, decades later. I look at people differently because of what that film taught me about other human beings. And then the third thing for me was I saw for the first time what a movie could be. And so I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to tell these kinds of stories that reveal characters and that move people, that provide meaningful emotion. So for me, seeing Ordinary People became a dividing line in my own life on multiple levels. And so for me, that is a defining moment.
And I assume you saw it in the theater?
I did. I saw it in the theater. I own the DVD. It's still wrapped in cellophane because I can't bear to go back and watch it. I'm afraid it either is not as good as I remember or it will be, I don't know. I don't want it to disappoint me. And so I just keep it under wraps.
Yeah, I can agree with doing so. It's almost like it's frozen in time. There's something special there.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I don't want to disturb that memory because that memory is vivid and is kind of a bedrock of the person I've become.
And how were other people leaving the theater after watching that film?
I think other people were powerfully moved by it. Mary Tyler Moore delivers a fantastic performance as the sort of cold-hearted mother who is, the whole time she's on screen, you fear she's driving her son to suicide. And I remember wanting to take my shoe off in the theater and throw it at the screen when she was on screen, which is, what a testament to that performance. So I think, other people were really moved. I'm not sure how many people would point back to that experience as a defining moment in their lives. It's one of the things about film, I think, that is fascinating to me, that we all have different responses to it that are partly shaped by the film itself, but partly shaped by us and what we bring to the film.
Who are the characters in Ordinary People?
So you've got the dad, played by Donald Sutherland, the mom played by Mary Tyler Moore, and then this 17-year-old son. And then there's another brother who's really absent from the movie because he drowned before the events of the movie. That was a defining moment for that family. And each one of these characters responds in a different way. Mary Tyler Moore's mother character kind of makes it clear to her surviving son that she wishes that the other brother had survived. And that becomes the seed of his misery, is that sense of being rejected by his mother. And his dad is trying to figure out how to put his family back together after the tragic loss of the one son and just the terrible chemistry that's going on between mother and the surviving son, played by Timothy Hutton. And they're all doing the best they can, but it feels so real. At least to me, sitting in the theater, it felt like this is a real family. I didn't feel like I was watching a movie. And I think that that's also informed even the way that I approach writing. As a screenwriter, that's the tone I go for. I love naturalism. I don't write big, bombastic, comic book kinds of material because that's not what speaks to me. It is that sense of I've gotten lost in a dream, and this feels in some ways more real than reality, because a great film reveals more of the characters than sometimes I'm able to discover of the people that I actually know. And I find I really crave understanding who's really there. And so a film that shows that to me, I really love. And I strive to do that as a storyteller as well, to really peel back the layers and reveal who the characters are that we're dealing with.
I'm just curious, when did you purchase the DVD to Ordinary People?
Probably bought that something like 10 years ago. You know, I think I just came across it on a shelf somewhere. And when I first had that thing in my hands, I thought, well, I should watch this. And that I just kind of felt resistance in myself to that. And so then it ended up on my shelf of DVDs, and now it's even hard to find a DVD player in the house if I wanted to watch it.
Can you give us a general explanation of what a defining moment is?
Kathy, who's my co-author and my wife, and I first encountered the idea of defining moments through a mentor of ours, a television writer-producer named Coleman Luck. And he was mentoring us through a rewrite of a feature film that we had written early in our careers called After the Truth. And Coleman made us work really, really hard. He told us we would come to hate him. And I thought that was hyperbole, but he was right. He pushed us so hard. We didn't come to hate him. We have a tremendous respect for him. But I remember foolishly asking him at one point, do other writers really work this hard? And I've come to find out, yes, they do. The good ones do. But he had this idea that he shared with us, and the idea was all of us have a handful of experiences that have profoundly shaped us. So we live through lots of moments every day in our lives, but not every moment is equal in terms of its impact on shaping us. And Coleman believed that there were about maybe a half dozen moments that each one of us could point to that account for much of the person that we are today. And his idea was that the same would be true of characters. And if we wanted to deeply understand our characters, what drives them, how that broken character got broken, or how that broken character eventually heals, that we would locate that half dozen or so moments that have defined those characters, and that would actually be more valuable than understanding how much change is in the character's pocket, or so many of the infinite number of details that we could know about a character. Coleman's thought was, it is these moments that define the character that tell you more than anything else you could possibly know. And so Kathy and I began doing that work with our characters, looking into their pasts to discover the moments that had shaped them, and then looking into the time of the story, the time that's actually unfolding in a movie or a television episode, and saying, what are the moments that happen live in front of our eyes that not only have formed a character, but now in real time before us transform the character into who they're becoming. So for us, what we discovered about defining moments that helps us to locate them is they always tend to create this boundary between before and after. We talk about the time before the house burned down and the time after the house burned down. All of us on this planet will talk about the time before the pandemic, and please God, the time after the pandemic at some point. So the planet can have a defining moment. Individually, we can have defining moments. Families can have defining moments. And certainly characters, if they are lifelike, will have moments that define them as well.
How many defining moments are there in ordinary people?
Boy, you know, in Ordinary People, because it's been so many decades since I saw the film, that I can just say off the top of my head, there was the moment of the drowning. So when the oldest brother dies tragically, that is a moment that defines the whole family. And then also, and so that happens before the movie begins. And then another defining event is when Timothy Hutton's character attempts suicide. And that creates another before and after moment. For purposes of the film, the impact of that attempted suicide is that we as the audience, as soon as we know about that, are on the edge of our seats because we fear that he's going to complete the act, that he's going to take his life. And we like this kid, and we view that that would be tragic. And so we are rooting for that not to happen. We are infuriated by his mother's coldness to him. Every time he tries to connect with her, she pushes him away. And we just want to scream at her, don't you see what's happening? Don't you see how much he needs you? Can't you put your arms around your son? All of that is rooted in that defining moment of the suicide attempt, which is made known to the audience so that we get the good out of it. We get the emotional juice that flows from that. And then there's a defining moment of a kind of connection, if I am remembering the movie correctly, that happens between Timothy Hutton and his dad, Donald Sutherland, that makes you believe that maybe they're going to make it. And so it creates this other turning point, a kind of provisional healing. There may be more in there. Those are the three that remain in my memory. So it's a film of a lot of pain and grief, but it's also a hopeful film. But it's bittersweet because the mom's character doesn't get to participate in that reconciliation. And again, if I go back and ever crack open that DVD, I may find out I'm remembering wrong. But in my memory, those are the three key defining moments that immediately come to my mind.
Can you explain why a writer must understand their own story before they can essentially understand any character's stories that they may invent?
My wife, Cassie, took this idea of defining moments and pushed it a step further by saying, this isn't just about concocting moments for our characters, it really begins with us understanding our own story. So when she teaches young writers, will say again and again, before you can understand your character's story, you have to understand your own story. So if we're going to understand the dynamic of the way moments can reshape us and transform us, the best place for us to look is in our own experience. We have a front row seat to our own invisible inner emotional life. And so we've got to be willing to draw on that. But before I can draw on my own life, my own defining moments, I have to actually locate them. So while I might not want to crack open an old DVD, I have to crack open my own history if I'm going to tap into the emotional riches that lie there for all of us, because we all have, in the words of author Frederick Buechner, wonderful and terrible things that have happened to us all. And so the idea is that we would look at those things. So as an example, a kind of moment that might define us would be the moment a dream was born. And so somebody who's pursuing acting, directing, writing, often that's based around a dream. And so the question that I would ask is, when was that dream born? Can you locate the moment of birth for that dream? And sometimes there is a moment, and sometimes things emerge so gradually that we can't locate a moment. We've got glaciers that creep imperceptibly, but then we also have glaciers when they reach the sea that in dramatic fashion will calve a glacier in a moment. What we're interested in as dramatists are those dramatic moments. So the tectonic plates of the earth move millimeter by millimeter over the decades, centuries, millennia. It's not that interesting to watch, but there is an instant when they rupture and we have an earthquake. Those are the dramatic moments. So there are times when changes happen in us by these gradual processes, and that we may not call those defining moments, but there are these cataclysmic, seismic moments of change that make great stories, but also really help to define how that change happened. So you might look back and say, let me locate what is that moment where I became obsessed with screenwriting? When is that moment when I had to make movies or had to make television? We also think about characters and we think about people as being broken, damaged. And so we can look back and say, not only, I know I've limped like this for a long time, but we can ask the question, when did I get that limp? What was the moment of injury? And if we understand that moment, we get a great story, but we also understand maybe if this is how it happened with me, this may be how it happens with my characters as well. And I don't only want to tell bleak stories about people being injured and damaged. I am interested in a credible kind of hope. And so I'm also interested in asking, like, was there ever a time where I grew? Was there ever a time where I healed? That I overcame a fear? What did that moment look like? And if I understand that in myself, then I'm in a position to portray that in a character, and that will be lifelike and emotionally authentic because it's rooted in something that I've actually experienced. So I think that that is the vulnerability and the cost that comes with being a storyteller, is that we have to be willing to do that dive into our own emotional story and be willing disguised or not, to bring those stories forward. And it's tough. You go into a meeting at a studio and you sit with a producer or an executive and you pitch this character arc and you say, I think this is where this character's damage comes from. And what you're really telling is a story from your own history. You don't necessarily tell them that. But if that gets shot down, well, that's a little bit vulnerable. That's sort of a rejection of you and your pain and your past. But there's also the possibility that the producer will say, oh, that's right, something like that happened to me. And suddenly you've got a common point of reference for this character. And certainly when you are communicating with a big audience, if those moments actually make it to the screen, you've created the possibility of connection with thousands of people, millions of people, in a way that they really relate to. And when we connect at that deep level with characters, we care. We're invested emotionally in what happens to them. That's what gets us sitting on the edge of our seats. It's not just that we've got spectacular visual effects and characters zipping across the screen. If I don't care about those characters, I'm bored with even the most spectacular visual effects. If I identify with a character and deeply care what happens to them, then the tiniest movement, either toward or away from danger, I feel viscerally. So I think that's the value for writers in connecting with their own defining moments so that they can then enrich their work with the insights they gain.
In some of our comments, I've seen people mention that they didn't have anything too tragic to write about, but they were still able to portray that in their stories. And they said, I didn't come from a dysfunctional family and I had a great childhood, but there's this myth that I have to be damaged in order to be a great writer. Do you ever see people that are just too far on the spectrum? Either everything is just tragic and woe is me and there was no growth, and then others that now everything was like Disneyland.
I do encounter writers a lot who, when I ask them to find moments that have shaped them, struggle with that and often discount their life experience as boring or low stakes. And I had one student who was not a 20-year-old who came to me. I knew that she was a pediatrician, but she came to me with this problem of nothing's happened to me. And I said, well, so your career is you work in the hospital with desperately ill children and their families. I think you have experienced deeply emotional, high stakes things. And she thought about it and she said, well, I guess it's true. I am a 50-year-old woman and no man has ever loved me. And I said, then you have lots of stories. You have deep emotion. But I think we have to honor our own life experience and not dismiss it as unimportant. Now, somebody who who wallows in tragedy and damage, I think that we want more than stories of chaos. I think we do want stories that help us make sense of lives that often feel like chaos to us, at least while we're in the middle of the story. And so I really value stories told by writers who are able to go out into life and experience it and come back and help make some sense of it, even if it is not the neat Disney package. I think of Joel and Ethan Coen's No Country for Old Men. And there's not a ton of hope in that movie. There's a line about, I think it's Tommy Lee Jones who says, "You can't stop what's coming," referring to just this sort of growing evil that he was seeing in the world as a sheriff or marshal in Texas. That's kind of hopeless. You can't stop what's coming. Toward the end of the film, Tommy Lee Jones' character tells a story of riding out into the wilderness. I think it's a dream he has. He's on a horse riding out into the wilderness, and his dad has ridden out ahead of him and has lit a campfire. And he says in his dream, he's riding along and he catches sight far off in the distance of that campfire. And that's it. That's all the hope that there is in that movie. But it's enough to say, somewhere out there in the darkness, there is warmth and there is light. Keep riding. That can be, for somebody who experiences a lot of adversity, that can ring true to them in a way that a Disney movie never will. That can be credible hope. And so I value that kind of storytelling, and I would push a writer who only sees bleakness to look harder, in the same way that I would encourage a writer who only sees happiness to be more honest with themselves and own up to whatever the pain and disappointments have been. That's hard to do. I think sometimes that can only happen after some therapy and after some years have passed and we can dare to crack open the package and look inside. But I think the audience craves that kind of honesty.
I'm trying to remember back to Patch Adams. It's been a little bit since I've seen it, but speaking of a pediatrician, I think at some point it's revealed why the character wants to, bring joy to these children in sort of this clown-esque type persona.
Yeah, I think there's some tragic past which keeps it from being a silly movie. It's not a silly movie. And it's the pain and the darkness that balances out the fact that he wears a clown nose to clinic. He knows something about pain. And of course, Robin Williams knew a lot about pain, was well acquainted with that. And that undergirded both his dramatic acting and his comic acting.
How does a writer find defining moments in their own life?
Kathy and I have developed kind of a list of characteristics that we think describe defining moments, and that they help us when we go looking for defining moments. So that list includes things like the moment a dream was born. It could be the moment a dream died. Sometimes defining moments are moments of birth or death. And that can be a literal death, or it could be a figurative death, the death of a business, the death of a relationship, or the birth of a relationship. We think about moments of discovery. So for a child who's been adopted, the moment they discover that they were adopted might redefine their understanding of themselves. A special kind of discovery is a lesson that's learned. So Dorothy in Oz makes the discovery that there's no place like home. And that discovery becomes the mantra that allows her to travel back to Kansas. It was the discovery that she needed when she set out from Kansas. She didn't think that the people at home were special enough to cherish. She thought that real life lay somewhere out there. And along the way, she makes the discovery that there's no place like home. And that redefines who she is. Sometimes we're looking for a moment when a wound was suffered or a loss was incurred. Other times we're looking for a moment of the birth of hope or a moment of healing, a moment of deep emotional or spiritual change. And with that, it's not a checklist, but those categories, we can look at our own lives and say, well, what was a moment of deep emotional change that I've experienced? If I'm a morose person, was I always that way? And if not, when did that change? Kathy found an old black and white picture of her dad when he was a young boy. And Kathy's dad, as I knew him, was a serious mechanical engineer and not playful. That's the last word I would use for him. And yet this picture showed this impish kid with this like wicked smile on his face. And Kathy and her brother turned to each other when they found this picture and said, "Did you know that person?" And they both said, "No, I never met that guy." Well, what was the moment when he went from the playful imp to the very serious, very dour person that my wife grew up with? That at least turns our gaze in the right direction. And we can start looking and seeing, is there a moment like that? Now, there are times I think that we can't find the moment, either because it happened when we were so young that we have no memory of it, or it may be so traumatic that we have not allowed ourselves to remember it. But we know we walk with the limp. And I discovered in myself a sort of evidence of a wound that I don't ever remember suffering. But I remember as far back as 6 years old having the damage. And so I don't know what that defining moment was. I just know that it exists. And I know that I learned from that experience that I must not let people know the real me, or they would not want me. I learned that men are dangerous, and I had to, I have no memory that accounts for those things, but I had to look at that history nonetheless and recognize those lies as being so deep in my firmware that I couldn't remember a time where they weren't there. And then I had to learn the truth that would neutralize those lies. And I still feel like those lies are true, but I now know they're not, and I'm able to tell myself, here's the truth. There are people who actually know you, and they actually love you. And so the lie that if people know you, they won't love you, that's a lie, no matter how that feels. And I've learned I'm not a little boy anymore, and I don't have to be afraid of grown-ups. It's not actually dangerous to have human encounters, even though it still feels dangerous to me. Well, so I've just described a moment of healing. That's also a defining moment. I had to be more than 50 years old to experience that moment of healing. This, to me, is the advantage that writers have with every passing year. We keep getting more and more life experience, and so we have more and more to draw on. If you're 20, well, you've been through middle school, so you have, you've come through at least one war.
That's painful.
And, yeah. Yes, and so, I always think of the popular kids. I'm not sure they exist. I haven't met anyone as an adult who says, oh yeah, I breezed through 8th grade. It was awesome, my favorite year. It's just awful. But a 20-year-old is going to have 20 years of life experience. A 40 or a 50 or a 60-year-old writer is going to have more life experience. And so while the industry may have a preference, for 22-year-old writers because it's exciting, like it's exciting to get a new sports car, mostly we give awards out to people with a little more mileage on them. And it's because, in part, of the greater life experience, which gives you more access to these kinds of moments.
You just jogged my memory because I knew someone who was considered very popular, and their worry was they thought, A, everyone thought they were stuck up, and B, they were worried about their image. And when they left the house, how did they look to everybody? So to them, that was a huge concern because they were afraid of breaking that image. And to me, I saw the person as had it all together, and they had all these people around them that wanted to be around them, but they were terribly concerned. So I guess you're right that to them, it was still tragic.
I do think about people whose faces are on magazine covers, and there is a burden that goes with that. Now we might think, oh, boo-hoo, you're beautiful and famous, but there's a burden that goes even with the popularity that rises to the level of celebrity. Of an acquaintance once said to one of my children, you don't know how hard it is to be so pretty. And at the time I thought, that's a line I need to put in a script. But as you talk, I think, no, that actually, for this young lady, she experienced that as pain and anxiety, and all of that kind of human experience is interesting to me, both as a human but also as a storyteller. That's an interesting character. That wasn't my life experience, but it's an experience that's interesting to me.
Is there a limit on how many defining moments someone can have in their life?
I've been thinking a lot lately about defining moments, and I keep discovering more of them for myself. I'm not sure that the half dozen is any sort of absolute limit at all. I think that our lives don't continue in a straight line. There are reversals. There are moments of transformation. Our lives seem to unfold kind of in chapters. We don't just do the same thing the same way forever. Well, the whole world with COVID has experienced that things actually change, sometimes quite dramatically. So I could probably put my finger on a dozen moments that from my own life that are pretty profound and create distinct moments of before and after. So I don't know that there's an absolute limit. I just think that practically speaking, when we come to characters, we probably want to work with a manageable number of them so that we don't dilute their impact and their power, especially if we're thinking of a standalone feature film. If we're talking about a television series that goes for many, many episodes, then you probably could do justice to a dozen defining moments over, 100 episodes, if anybody is doing 100 episodes anymore. At some point, Aristotle talked about how many acts there should be in any play. And he said, well, it just depends how long the play is, because an act has to do with a reversal. And he says there should be a big reversal in each act. A life that is nothing but reversal starts to feel not like a real life. It would be like a football game where there was an interception or a fumble on every play. It just becomes absurd. But he says you've got to have enough of them to keep it interesting. So that's his formula. He doesn't tell us, how many acts there should be in a 1-hour television pilot. But the general principle is there should be enough to keep it interesting, but not so many that it becomes absurd. And I suppose the same could be said of defining moments.
Once a writer has processed their own defining moments, how do they begin to apply that knowledge to the characters that they create?
Well, when I think about applying the idea of defining moments to characters, I think in terms of these categories. So if I've got a character who has a dream, I've already looked back at my moment of watching Ordinary People and seeing this dream of somehow getting my fingers into the clay of filmmaking. So I know about how at least one dream was born. Then I can come to my character and say, for this character, what does it look like when their dream was born? Now, their dream may be to be an astronaut. And so I would think about, well, what is analogous from my experience to their experience? I was watching a movie. An astronaut dream might have been born as somebody who was watching a shuttle launch or the tragic loss of a shuttle. That immediately interests my writer's brain because it's unexpected that you would see a catastrophic loss of a space shuttle and say, that's what I want to do. But I think that's actually often how it works. I've described television writing to aspiring writers and the atmosphere in the writer's room and how you have to compete to get your joke on the page and how cutthroat that can be. And I think I've just talked everyone out of wanting to be a television writer. And then people will crowd to the front and say, that sounds fantastic. That's exactly what I want to do. So that tells me that sometimes it's even seeing a story that seems like it would drive you away that actually attracts the diehard dreamer. So I bring that sort of general experience from life. I kind of mix it up with what I've observed in myself. And I will often try to brainstorm a bunch of different options of what that defining moment might be until I find one that both feels emotionally real and also makes an interesting story, because I might have the character tell the story, or we may flash back to see that story. The writer Bill Marsili, who wrote the film Deja Vu, talks about his discipline of brainstorming 20 options for any creative choice. And his theory, he says, is that no one is smart enough to come up with 20 bad ideas in a row. So one of your 20 ideas is bound to be decent. So I've taken to calling that Marsili's rule of 20. It is a discipline because often when we're coming up with, say, a potential defining moment for a character, we want to just jump at the first thing that occurs to us. Part of becoming a mature writer is recognizing that it's not supposed to be that easy. And so we want to stick with it and keep coming up with options so that we don't pick the first thing that occurs to us, which probably is the first thing that is going to occur to everyone else. We want to get to something else further down the line that's unexpected, that we haven't seen before. And if I'm drawing from my own life experiences, that has a real chance of being fresh because it's drawn from life, not from the movies. So that would be how I would go about finding, say, one defining moment. So a dream is born. Maybe in the course of the film, this dream is going to die. So then I would look at my own life and also lives of people around me that I know well and say, where have I seen a dream die? And I can think for myself a defining moment where dreams died. And in my experience, dreams die slowly. They die kicking and screaming. We don't want to admit that thing that you dreamed is not going to happen. And so I would draw on that and say, how do I bring that to this character? And I would keep doing that until I had that handful of moments that gives me an understanding of this character that makes them complex and relatable and interesting. And when I can feel myself when a character starts to come alive in this way. And I know I want to spend time with that character and I want to hear the dialogue that they're going to say. And I want to see them get into whatever trouble the story is getting them into. And I want to see them struggle to get out of that trouble, to get to their goal. And I also want to watch them grow over the course of that story, either for good or for ill. They're going to change. And they're going to change in these moments, these pivot points. And so I just keep at it until I feel like I have this full character. It's an organic, messy process, definitely not paint by the numbers, but having my own history and an understanding of myself to draw on, also having this sort of set of characteristics of defining moments helps me at least know where to look. And then I try to keep looking until I found what I need to find.
It's interesting because we're talking about defining moments for various characters and knowing them. Sometimes if I've watched a biopic, I feel as if the filmmaker has tried to cram in so many defining moments that it loses some of the impact of them. And I think it's because there's so much to tell.
Yeah.
But then I've seen documentaries where they also do the same, and for some reason it lands better. I don't know why that would be.
I don't know. I do think that the best biopics tend to focus on a single event. I think of Spielberg's Lincoln. And, you know, we know so much of Abraham Lincoln's life and career. And Spielberg and Tony Kushner, the screenwriter, chose to focus on just a single vote in the U.S. House of Representatives about the amendment to the Constitution that outlawed slavery. And so out of everything you could look at in Lincoln's life and career, the film focuses on a single event. And I think we get a bunch more dramatic power focused when we do that. And it can be really tempting if you're doing a biopic because so many interesting things happened in many people's lives. If we were doing Winston Churchill, there'd be so many things to focus on. But the fantastic film Darkest Hour focuses very specifically on the couple of weeks leading up to Winston Churchill's speech to Parliament, where he declares we're going to fight on the beaches, we're going to fight on the landing fields, where he galvanizes the British people to oppose the Nazis. That is a dramatic move to restrict yourself in that way. And at the risk of sounding disgustingly like a film professor, I'll go back to Aristotle one more time. And Aristotle, as long ago as that, said that the drama should be about a single event. And I think he's right. And I think that for reasons I don't understand, we are geared toward a story of a hero struggling against obstacles to reach a goal. There is a unity to drama that both focuses its power, but also helps to give it meaning, because there's a configuration of events that becomes meaningful. These choices and these actions led to this outcome. So it gives us this sense of completion that I think it's one of the things that we long for from our stories.
When we're developing a character, how much are we charting out all of sort of the wonderful and terrible things that have happened to them? Are we doing this beforehand, before we get into the actual story? We're kind of coming up with a checklist of defining moments?
This is one of the confounding qualities of storytelling. We don't have a linear process where we do this first and this second. We sort of try. We have to approach the story somehow. But I think that what we do is I typically have a notion for what is the story. Maybe in a sentence, what is the story I want to tell? And that tells me something about a character, and also something about the plot. That it's somebody like this trying to, climb out of a well. And so, but then I go back to the character and I say, well, I have more questions for you, character. Where did you come from? How did you get in that well? What were you doing in that field in the first place? And sometimes the answers are really surprising to me. Sometimes they come as sort of epiphanies as I'm out for a run or taking a shower or lying in bed. Often, though, they come as a result of just the ditch digging of sitting and asking these questions. I know that this person, to be interesting, needs to have both strength and weakness. When did they discover they had that strength? When did they first experience the crippling quality of that weakness? And then I bring the character back to the story. And now they're doing more interesting things that I didn't expect them to do, because there's more to that character. And so I discover more twists and turns that are potential within, say, the events or the plot of the story. And then I go back to the character. So it's a very messy, recursive process. When I am finding these defining moments for a character, I don't know if any of them will end up on screen. At first, I'm just discovering what are these moments. And then, so there are things I can do with a defining moment. I can just know about it, and it's going to inform how I write dialogue for this character. Other times, I'm going to say, if I were writing Pixar's Finding Nemo, I would say, oh, that moment when Marlin's whole family gets eaten by a barracuda, I think we should see that. That's really visual and exciting and tragic. would Pixar allow us to start a children's movie with that kind of scene? Because if we were to do that, then we would really understand why Marlin is this overprotective father who won't let Nemo have any adventure, have any fun, experience any danger. And we won't view him just as, oh, that neurotic Marlin. We will feel with him. Well, of course, he is a hypervigilant parent because this tragedy struck him and we witnessed it, we experienced it with him. Now, when I first came up with that, I didn't, somebody did. If I was the one who had come up with that, I wouldn't have known at first. Does that make it into the movie or not? There are other moments that we don't see, but a character talks about. They just tell you the story of what happened, or they allude to the story, whatever makes great dialogue. And then other times there are moments right in the middle of the movie where a character transforms. And here I think the great example is Michael Corleone in The Godfather. So we know that Michael is a war hero just back from World War II. He's the son who was not supposed to get mixed up with the family's crime business. He was supposed to go on and maybe be a senator, maybe even a president. But after his father gets gunned down, Michael decides he's got to take matters into his own hands. And so he goes to meet the crime boss who had his father gunned down and the police captain who protects that other crime boss, because to meet them at an Italian restaurant. He has a gun planted in the bathroom. And he excuses himself from the table, goes back to the bathroom, gets the gun. And then there's this long pause as Michael smooths his hair and sort of allows himself to make his choice. Am I going to step across this threshold from which there can be no return or not? And then the director has set it up so Michael has to pass through 3 sets of doors as he returns into the restaurant from the bathroom, just to emphasize visually, this is a threshold. There is a real boundary of before and after here. Michael walks out into the restaurant, guns down the police captain and the other crime boss, and the rest of the movie, and the next movie, and the next movie, the die is cast for all of those in that moment of the change of Michael's legal status from war hero to killer. There's also a moral and a spiritual change that happens in him. And he thinks he's done this for all the best reasons, for family, but in the end, he becomes someone who kills members of his family for the family. And he is undone by this action, by this choice that he's made in a moment that defines him. So you find that moment and you think, that's probably a scene in the movie. And in fact, that becomes the fulcrum of the whole movie, the moment that defines Michael as who will become the Godfather. So you find all of these, but they're like, they're cards in your poker hand, and you're not sure where you're going to play them or even if you're going to play them. And that is the messy, organic, artistic process, I suppose, of crafting a story. But you can't craft it if you don't have the raw materials from which to craft it. And I think that defining moments are one of those really rich materials that we have to work with when we're telling stories about characters.
If we look at Forrest Gump, does he have defining moments?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. So Forrest, he experiences a moment that doesn't transform his inner nature. His inner nature is constant. He's an innocent. That's his genius. But when the movie opens, he's an innocent alone. And the moment that he climbs onto the school bus and meets Jenny defines his life. His life will never be the same after that moment that he climbs onto the school bus. And in fact, there's dialogue in the film where he says, I can't quote it, but it's funny what a person remembers. I don't remember my first pair of shoes, etc. He says, but I do remember the first time I heard the sweetest voice in the whole wide world. And he meets Jenny on the bus. She invites him to sit beside her. And he says in very defining moment language, from that moment on, we was like peas and carrots. So he experiences a moment that defines him, even though it doesn't redefine his inner nature. It defines his experience of life. I think that when Forrest finds out he's got a son, that is a transforming moment. It redirects the course of his life. His life will now be about caring for little Forrest. And I think that Jenny's death is also probably a defining moment for him, because his life, at least as told in the movie, is bookended by meeting Jenny and then losing Jenny. But receiving from her the gift of his son, and that then will define the rest of Forrest's life. So defining moments don't always transform, say, the nature of a person, but they can still change the course of their lives. I think we see that with Jack in Titanic. Jack is not a character who really has a big need to grow and change. Rose definitely needs to be transformed. When we meet Rose, she's ready to leap off the back of the ship to her death. By the time the movie's done, Rose is all about surviving. So she has been transformed. Jack is still kind of the same guy. But I think we could say that meeting Rose is a defining moment for Jack. And if he had not met her, certainly those 3 or 4 days of the voyage would have been different. And while that sounds like a short period of time, that was his whole life. That was all the life he had left. He might also say winning that card game that got him the ticket on Titanic would also be a defining event in his life.
Yeah, so with Forrest Gump, it seems as if there were maybe stronger, in some sense, turning point, like in terms of the defining moments that changed a lot of the people. Because if you look at Lieutenant Dan, he was so angry, he was so competitive, he had so much vengeance. And then toward the end, when you see him at the wedding, he's a different person. He's transformed.
Yes. So for Lieutenant Dan, his life was on a clear course toward what he thought was his destiny, which was to die heroically in battle, which that was what his family did. And Forrest intervened and pulled him out of danger and disrupted the course that Lieutenant Dan thought his life was supposed to be on. So that was a moment that redefined Lieutenant Dan's life in a way Lieutenant Dan despised. And then Lieutenant Dan was on that course of being completely unhappy with a life that he saw as he's been cheated. So all he's got now is just emptiness until he is on the shrimping boat in the middle of the hurricane with Forrest, and he climbs up the mast in the middle of that hurricane and has a screaming match with God over his destiny. And Forrest tells us that in that moment, he believes that God and Lieutenant Dan somehow came to peace with each other. And Lieutenant Dan is a different person after that, which makes possible Lieutenant Dan showing up at the wedding. Now he's got new legs, he has a wife, and he's no longer the bitter person. He's been made whole. And within the movie, we have the two pivot points. The rescue, which denied him his destiny, and then the confrontation between Lieutenant Dan and God in the midst of a hurricane, which then makes his growth possible. So we can only understand Lieutenant Dan's character arc through those two pivot points.
And then with Jenny, she recommends for Forrest, to run from the bullies. But really that's a metaphor for what she'd been doing all her life. And so we don't see her toward the end until, she comes back and she's changed, but we just know that she was a runner herself, and then she's much different.
Yes, and in many ways, the moment that made it possible for her to come home happened off screen. We understand, well, we see her hit bottom when she climbs up on that railing of a balcony at a New Year's Eve party, I think. And so we understand that either we've seen a defining moment or that she is in the zone where those things kind of happen. Her return to Forrest is evidence that she has had this transformative kind of experience. But I think it shows us that defining moments can be if we're talking about playing cards, they can be played in different ways. They can be played on screen, off screen, through just a character recounting something that happened, or we end up with more defining moments than we can actually use. It's one of my frustrations. I was working today on my next feature screenplay, and the last 2 pages after fade out are a nice little dialogue scene that tells the story of my main character's defining moment. And I know that that's going to fall out of the script because it doesn't need to be in there. But I needed to know what that moment was so that I could write the rest of what that character says and does. So that even when these defining moments don't end up on screen, they still enrich my understanding. This is also something that can be really valuable for actors, for them to understand not only that this is true of my character, but why this is true of my character. So I'll tell a story out of school. When I worked at Warner Brothers in the script department, the movie Twister started shooting before the script was fully written. And producer Ian Bryce called me up and said, can you send a script typist to Oklahoma to work with the writer as he finishes writing this movie while we shoot it? And I said, that sounds like too much fun. I'll send myself. So I was on a plane the next day to Oklahoma City, and I ended up out in the middle of a farm field with 300 vehicles and making this big tornado action movie. Helen Hunt plays a meteorologist who's chasing tornadoes obsessively for reasons that no one knew at the moment, because that scene hadn't been written yet. So she's having to go out and she's trying to put this scientific instrument, place it in the path of a tornado so it'll be sucked up and they'll learn all kinds of things about tornadoes. She's putting her life at risk, putting her relationships at risk, and at some point, they know, we'll write the scene for her backstory, the defining moment that made her a tornado hunter. But they didn't need to film that for several weeks into the future. And they didn't seem to take into account that Helen Hunt, as an actor, would like to know why she's doing all these things. Eventually, they came up with what we would describe as a defining moment, a moment from her childhood when she experienced a killer tornado, and that birthed in her the dream that she would someday make the world safer by getting people more advance warning of tornadoes. My argument is it would have been a real service to Helen Hunt as an actor to know what that was while she was chasing those tornadoes. And that I'll just use as a metaphor for the way that an understanding of defining moments can be of use and of value to actors, certainly, directors, editors, cinematographers, everyone. You know, I described the way Michael Corleone is in the bathroom in that pivotal defining moment for The Godfather. You can see evidence that everyone on the team appreciated what that moment meant for that character and for the film. The production designer had to design 3 sets of doors for the character to walk through. The cinematographer had to arrange the shot that way. The editor, the composer had to all support that moment, not cut past it because, oh my gosh, how much time are we spending in this bathroom? Nothing's going on in here. But everybody recognized that, yes, this is where Michael is going through this metamorphosis. And so we have to support and dramatize all of the interaction that is happening outside of our view. Somehow we have to make that visible on the screen. And the entire team understood, intuitively or not, what a defining moment that was, and built an entire film around that moment.
We've talked a lot about defining moments in drama, but in comedy as well. I mean, we could think of so many John Hughes films that had great defining moments, whether it was 16 Candles or Home Alone or something. I mean, there's just, is there a difference in the way that a comedic defining moment is done?
You know, I think I am not a comedy writer. It just gives me terrible anxiety to think about exchanging money for laughs. And I have friends who specialize in comedy. I think it's a gift that I don't have. But to the extent that I understand comedy, comedy works a lot like drama, except it's just funny. You know, we laugh. So when a character is pursuing a goal, they pursue it to absurd lengths in a way that you wouldn't do in a drama. But the character arcs still often have to do with character transformation. I think that the deepest and like most satisfying comedies really are dramas with laughs. And so I think that these defining moments absolutely exist. You might need a defining moment to help us understand why a character would do the absurd things that they do. But so that, you know, they may be of a different quality. When I brainstorm my 20 possibilities, I'm going to pick a different defining moment in a comedy than I am in a gritty drama, just for tone. But it's still performing those functions of either explaining why the hero wants what they want, why they need to grow and change the way they need to, or that's showing us the transformation as it unfolds step by step.
You and Kathy have a new book that just came out, The
Defining Moment, How Writers and Actors Build Characters.
Great. And we're wondering if there are certain chapters or a portion of the book that you can reference. First off, a moment or moments that damage or cripple a character? Do you have any references on that?
We do, because that's something that is critically important in storytelling, because we're so often dealing with characters who are damaged or crippled. So Kathy and I talk about, from the film Finding Nemo, the way Nemo's dad, Marlin, is damaged by the tragic loss of his family to a barracuda. But we also try to share some of our own defining moments, because we urge storytellers, writers, actors, directors to delve into their own histories, to find the moments that have defined them. In this case, moments that have damaged, wounded, crippled them. In the history of our family, when we think of defining moments, there's one moment that stands above all the others, and it was the moment when our son Peter, as a 5.5-year-old little boy, was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And our pediatrician put the MRI films in our hands and said, you need to drive to UCLA Medical Center. A brain surgeon will be waiting for you, and he'll explain everything. And so Kathy and I got in the car, and the doctor said, and don't stop anywhere on the way. So we put our son in the car, drove to the ER, and as we turned into the entrance to the ER, we looked at each other, and I think Kathy was the one who said, in this moment, like, our lives are changing forever. And that was true. We now in our family talk about the moment before Peter got sick, and we talk about the moment after Peter's brain tumor. My daughter's life experience was different from that moment on. Her best friend and brother suddenly was out of her life and in the hospital, and she wasn't seeing him. And when she did finally see him after surgery, he was changed. The tumor was gone, but he didn't speak, didn't walk. He looked to her like a monster. And for Peter, that was a defining moment. It was a moment that crippled him, that made him, and Peter, many years later, is alive. But as a result of the surgery, radiation, which isn't good for little boys' brains, and chemotherapy, he's kind of a real-life Forrest Gump. Pure of heart, and he knows what love is, and he struggles intellectually. So that was a moment of wounding for him. It was the beginning of the death of the dreams that we had for him. We had to find new dreams to replace the ones that died. And it took a long time, though. We were the ones who were dragged kicking and screaming to recognizing the dreams that were not going to happen now for him. Even as we approached his 16th birthday, and people his age were going to get driver's licenses, none of us wants to live in a world where Peter Riley has a driver's license, because he just cannot process all of the information fast enough. And he would get it right 95% of the time, but that's not enough on the streets of LA. And so I had to eventually say to him, Peter, you're not going to get a driver's license. And so he's found a new dream. He heard about the Google car. And so he's all about a self-driving car. As soon as he can get one, he wants a car that's going to take him wherever it can take him. We had to absorb a lot of losses But a day came when Peter had struggled along in school, got to high school, and in California, there's a test you have to pass in order to get a diploma called the California High School Exit Exam. It's a standardized test. So no matter how much people at the school loved him and helped him, there was no way he was going to get a diploma if he didn't pass this test. And I remember the day that the results came in the mail, and I just heard Kathy screaming in the other part of the house. She'd opened the envelope, and he had passed by like a whisker. And so we got to go to his high school graduation. And, I'd been in high school, and I know how it works. People applaud based on how popular you are when your name is called. And so my family had all come to his graduation, and I was telling everybody, you've got to like cheer your brains out because we have to be as loud as possible. And Kathy was just saying, oh, I don't care about that. I just hope he doesn't fall off the stage. And they called his name, and the entire senior class came to their feet applauding because they all recognized what he had overcome in order to earn that diploma. Kathy and I look at that experience as a defining moment. For us, that was a moment of healing. It was a moment where we got back some of what we had lost. And Peter still struggles. He had another defining moment where just in an afternoon, he lost his hearing. And that happened recently. Further isolated him and made his life harder, made our lives harder. It's really hard to raise your voice so that he can hear us and not feel angry when you're shouting. Your body won't disconnect shouting and anger. And so we're always struggling with, like, how do I talk loudly enough for him to hear me and not have to apologize for it afterwards? We're not unique in experiencing moments of loss. One of the things that experiencing loss has sensitized us to is that everyone experiences losses. And often those losses happen out of view. They're not visible when we go to the grocery store. And we believe it's true of our characters as well. I think you can't work with characters in this way without becoming more compassionate, without becoming aware of what people are suffering. And so in that way, I hope this book is a humanizing force within our industry and helps people gain more compassion for one another and also for their characters. And maybe through their characters, even the audience will grow in the kind of compassion and sensitivity and humanity that movies helped to bring to me. Our business could probably do with some of that. Our world could probably do with some of that.
Do you have a favorite chapter, you and Kathy? Defining moment?
I wrote a book about script format a few years ago, and this is a very different kind of book because so much of our heart is on the page. I think probably the chapter that guides the reader through discovering their own defining moments is my favorite chapter. It's the chapter where we share many of our own moments. Sometimes, big moments like the brain tumor moment, but also smaller, quieter moments that have also shaped us. We do that as an encouragement to our readers to be willing to look and find their own defining moments, And we also do it as a way to model what some of those moments look like and how you might describe them. I think this book in some ways is my response to seeing ordinary people all those years ago, experiencing a film that reached out and made connection with me as a human being. And this book is me reaching back out into the world to connect in the way that I was connected with, to help readers feel less alone. But this is a very specific group of readers. These are our filmmakers. These are our actors and writers and directors and novelists. These are the people who tell stories in our time. So I consider it a massive privilege to get to have a voice helping to equip storytellers to tell stories that will help connect us.
Was there any story the two of you struggled to maybe leave in or leave out? Was there one that you felt, you shared some incredibly personal stuff just here, and I think it could be beneficial for so many people, but there's a risk,
Right.
And that's, yeah.
Yeah, I think that Kathy struggled with how much to tell about her relationship with her dad, which was not warm and close. He was a dad who never ever said the words to her, "I love you." And she wants to honor her dad. Her dad was a good man, but he was not a warm man. And so she struggled with whether to put that story in or out of the book. And ultimately, the stories in the book, she did it in a way that was honoring to him. She actually drew on words she said at his funeral. And for me, I think speaking of this moment that I can't remember, a moment that seems to be of abuse in my early childhood, that was one that I hesitated to include and wanted to be very kind of wise about how I told that story. But it's also one of the stories I'm most interested in sharing because I think it could be somehow encouraging or beneficial to someone else. And I think I found my way to understanding that story through films and documentaries that I identified with. And I was feeling really powerful emotions watching documentaries in ways that didn't make sense to me, that I should be reacting that way. And watching those films ended up leading me into a counseling dialogue that has like really helped me put my finger on the lies that had crippled me and allowed me then to figure out what was actually true. So that's my hope, is that in sharing these stories, the stories become gifts that we give to a reader, to an audience. And stories work in a way that is almost magical. I can't explain how stories work, how each of us can hear the same story, read the same book, watch the same movie, and we connect with it in our own way. We're moved by it in our own way. We make very personal application. So as we send these stories out into the world, I don't know what will happen, but I'm hopeful, and I look forward to getting some emails in return.
Can we talk about moments that heal or repair a character?
I love moments in film where there is restoration of some kind that happens in a way that seems believable, that doesn't seem Shangri-La. I think about the film Blood Diamond in this regard. So there's really two stories that happen in Blood Diamond. We have the story of a South African diamond merchant played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who is trafficking in these blood diamonds. I think the movie takes place in Sierra Leone. And so he's on the hunt for this giant diamond that he's heard has been found out in the mines that are run by the rebel military. And the rebel military conscripts boys as child soldiers, both to fight for them, but also to work in these mines. The other main character is played by Djimon Hounsou, and he's the dad of a boy who has been abducted and taken away from his village, made to be a soldier who commits atrocities. So this young boy, 10 years old maybe, has been made to do horrible things, and his dad is determined to find his son and somehow bring him back to the family. And as he's doing that, he gets forced into working, digging for diamonds for the people who stole his son from him. And he finds this massive diamond. And he buries it out away from the camp and continues looking for his son. Leonardo DiCaprio finds out Djimon Hounsou's got this massive diamond hidden, and at gunpoint takes him to dig up this diamond. And just as they're digging for this diamond, Djimon Hounsou's son shows up and is holding a gun on both men. Leonardo DiCaprio alerts Djimon Hounsou, who's digging for the diamond, that his son is here. And so this father turns to his son, who now turns the gun to him, and is calling out, the son's calling out for help. And Djimon Hounsou says, "You're not one of them. You're my son, and I'm your father. Your mother waits for you. Your sister waits for you. The wild dog who listens to no one waits for you at home. You're not a bad boy. I know they made you do bad things, but you are going to come home to me and be my son again, and I'm going to love you." And in the midst of this, the father is walking toward his son, walking toward the barrel of the gun, and the son begins to cry and slowly lowers the gun and allows himself to be embraced by his father. That is written, directed, and acted in a way that you believe that. That is a moment of restoration and recovery that maybe shouldn't even be possible. That it would be, that you could recover a child who has been put through those experiences. The film presents it with a kind of emotional believability that certainly represents a defining moment for that boy and his father. That is going to be the pivot point. Certainly this kid's going to need probably lots of therapy and lots of love over lots of years to completely emerge from that awful darkness. But in that moment, you believe that there is real hope and that this moment represents a before and after, that they will look back 10 years from now and see that is the moment that the healing began, that the restoration began, and that love began to eclipse hate in the life of this boy. I think healing's like that. It doesn't usually come in a moment. Usually it comes a little bit at a time, but it has a beginning. And as storytellers, as filmmakers, we have the capacity to aim the camera, aim the attention of the audience at even the minutest movements so that we are able to perceive the moment when a process of healing begins and actually allow the audience to see, feel, and appreciate what's happened in a way that if we were on stage and we were looking at the proscenium, like you'd miss it. You'd never know it was happening. We have the capacity to zoom in on these massively significant movements of character that are almost imperceptible. Somebody has said that the job of the artist is to see and then to show others what they've seen. And for me, this is an example of that, of looking closely enough to see this monumental thing that's happening in this tiny little frame and blow that up so that we see it, we understand it, we appreciate its meaning, and we feel it. And it seems that combination of meaning and emotion are another of the things that we just really crave from our stories.
Just out of curiosity, what was the Leonardo DiCaprio character doing during that moment?
He was standing and watching. He had his assault rifle, and I think he was ready to shoot the boy if he felt he needed to. But he was also witness. He was bearing witness to this miracle moment.
So even, I haven't seen the film, but because his intentions sounds like they were not that honorable either.
No.
Okay, so he's seeing this, and do you see a little bit of change in that character at all?
Yes. Yeah. After that, he discovers that actually he's been shot in the firefight that happened just before this scene. He ends up really sacrificing himself to help father and son escape. So yeah, it does actually transform him to have witnessed this moment.
Before you and Kathy wrote the defining moment, what was your process for writing characters?
Kathy and I approach character from lots of different angles because characters are slippery critters that, have a lot of facets, a lot of dimensions. For many years, we have asked these questions about what are the moments that define these characters. So that's a really important part of what we've always done. We have a set of what we call the hero questions, where we ask things like, what does this character want? Because every character is driven by some intention. And then we ask, how does this character need to grow and change? Because the most interesting characters very often do transform in some way or even adjust. Not all characters in all genres transform, but often there's at least a small growth or adjustment in them, and that's satisfying. That's where some of the emotion comes from for the audience. We ask, what terrible thing will happen if the hero doesn't get what they want? And that helps us zero in on the stakes of the story, for the external stakes. And we ask, what terrible thing will happen if they don't grow and change in the way they need to? And that gets at the internal stakes. And we ask, how's the audience going to relate to this character? What are they going to be rooting for in relation to this character? Because we're really convinced that if we are not rooting for our protagonist, we're not going to be invested emotionally in the outcome of the story. And so if we don't care, we're bored. We also, we've got a list of character qualities that I've stolen from my friend, Dr. Sidney Showers. And so I call those Dr. Shower's 8 character traits. And she's a gifted writer who's just compiled this list of character traits. And they include some of the things that are included in the hero questions. But she asks some other things. She asks about a character's drive. And by that she means, what is that motor, even outside of the specific problem that's being solved in this movie? Oh, there's a killer asteroid headed toward Earth, and so our goal is to save the Earth. Well, what drives that character the rest of the time? Are they a person who's all about protecting people throughout their lives everywhere? Or is it about they're driven by recognition? And so I want to save the Earth because it'll make me famous. So that's the idea of the character's drive. And she thinks about the character's genius. And her idea is that every character has some strength or genius, whether it's high IQ, or in the case of Forrest Gump, it's not high IQ, but it's purity of love, purity of heart. Could be you're a great cello player. It's something that is a strength the character has. And then she thinks about characters' flaw and also their weakness as two different things. The weakness she thinks of as just an inability to do something. I don't write comedy, that's my weakness. I'm sure it's one element in a very long list. The flaw she thinks of more as a moral failure. A person's proud, cruel, selfish, fearful, something. All of these are just questions that prompt Kathy to think about our characters. And then we also get some insight into our characters by letting them talk. So when I was writing with Kathy our German film, After the Truth, that's a movie that's about the Auschwitz doctor, Joseph Mengele. And I knew that I needed to capture his voice as part of his character. What kinds of things does Mengele say? And so I sat down one afternoon and I just kind of wrote a rant in his voice. I just sort of allowed myself to inhabit that character. I read everything I could find out about him, every word that we knew he had written. And I inhabited that character and just wrote in his voice. And I wrote a lot. It wasn't dialogue, it was more of a kind of a blog post from Joseph Mengele. And then I, whatever the opposite of inhabited is, disinhabited that character, and I never went back in there. But I was able to just go back to those pages of journal entry or blog post in that character's voice as kind of a tuning fork that allowed me to write in that character's voice. And I've done that for other characters as well, as a way of pinning down a character's voice and being able to then draw on that. It's almost, I don't know anything about making sourdough bread, but I think that you've got this starter and you just need a little bit of it to get the dough going. And that's how that works. You've got that starter, and that allows you then to write dialogue for any scene from that character. It's a messy, iterative process. Often I will think about a character as I'm going to sleep at night, and I'll wake up and have some new insight into them. I really think that we need different strategies to just get us coming back over and over and over again to our characters and giving ourselves the opportunities to make more discoveries about them.
And just to go back to this metaphor about the sourdough starter, if I understand it correctly, that you can keep some of the starter still there in a cupboard, covered up. So it sounds like maybe there's, with this checklist, that's like the starter that you're keeping, because you're going to go back to this checklist that you talked about in the book that you have. What is it, like 20 questions or so?
Yeah, so I don't even know how many hero questions, plus if we add Dr. Shower's 8 character traits, that probably does get us to about 20. Yeah, writing a movie especially, or writing a TV series, it's a massive project. And having a starter is a big help. Just a place to grab that first thread and start pulling. So it's not a formula, it's not paint by numbers, but it at least is a way to say, here's how I'm going to start my work today, and make contact with this character. For the first time in my life, I directed a short film recently, and so I had to write a script. I did all of my writerly character stuff, but then there were weeks of prep and pre-production, casting, working with actors, and then shooting, which allowed me to just keep coming back to these characters over and over and over again. And what I discovered is you keep learning new things. Every time you sit down with your characters, you learn more and more and more. And eventually it's more than you can fit in the movie. So things start overflowing and falling out. But far better to come at this work with this overflowing just richness of character and knowledge about these characters that you can't even fit it all into the movie. I think that's what the audience wants, is a real density of ideas. We just keep discovering more. And the only way the audience is going to keep discovering more is if we have, before them, discovered more and more and more.
How has the defining moment changed the way you write characters?
I think that I began my writing life as a pretty lazy guy with low ambitions. I wanted to be just good enough to get to play in the game, which is ridiculous because nobody who's aiming to be mediocre gets to play in the game. Kathy is much more about, let's not do the least we can, let's do the most we can. So from the moment that we learned about defining moments, Kathy has been all about, let's do our homework, let's really dig into these characters. And I've had to grow into the discipline of it. And as I've been willing to invest the effort into spending time to really deeply understand my characters rather than rushing ahead because I can't wait to write that scene where the thing blows up, my writing gets better and deeper. So I'm excited now every time I approach a new character because I'm just asking all these questions and requiring myself not to rush ahead, but to take the time to really enrich the characters, enrich the script. The script I'm writing right now, I'm actually in a rewrite process where I paused and did all this defining moment work because I felt like a hypocrite, having written the book. I need to actually do this. Made wonderful discoveries, and I'm now in the process of enriching the script with all of those insights. So for me, it's made my writing, I think, objectively better, richer, more emotional. And the character's just more interesting.
So when you first started as a writer, what were some of the characters? What were some of the films that you wanted to emulate, aside from, we talked about Ordinary People?
Yeah, so besides Ordinary People, The Deer Hunter was also a film that was very influential on me. And then this is completely from a different genre, Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's just, for me, so much fun. Steven Spielberg really understands how to tell a story with action. It's not random action. And we are really with the character in the midst of it. We understand what's going on, what has to be achieved, what all the threats are. And then he tumbles you in that film out of the frying pan into the fire time after time. You end one action sequence and you tumble into the beginning of the next one. So that one for me is just a lot of fun and teaches me that movie going can be fun. It doesn't have to just be, this emotional ripping open of the soul. The Elephant Man is a film that I really love, and a real character study, a study of the connection between two characters who are very different. And in that movie, it's the audience that's transformed. So the first time that the Elephant Man is seen on screen, we cover our faces and turn away in horror at his hideousness. He doesn't change, but by the end of that movie, we are on a close shot of his face, and all we can see is his beauty. He didn't change, but we changed. And I love that film, that story can do that it can change what we see.
Chris, we had this comment come in overnight, and it's so beautifully written. I wanted to read it. It's from user halfxbreed23. And they write, I think a lot of writers have an obsession with their characters, which keeps the story from growing because they're too in love with them. Nothing is greater than the story. Nobody is greater than the story. Story is the sun, characters are flowers. The story allows characters to bloom.
I love that. I love that.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's right. Characters are in service to story. And by story, we don't mean plot. The story is the totality of the characters doing what they do as they struggle with all of the challenges they face. And a beautiful line that doesn't support the story has got to be cut. I think one of the great challenges is, after I've said we should, dig into our own defining moments, when we base a character on ourselves and it becomes too autobiographical, that can limit us. Because one of the things we have to look at are the character's flaws and complexities. And I don't want to think about my complexities, my contradictions. Where am I a hypocrite? Put that on the page for the world. So if I'm not willing to let the character and the story go where they need to, I can end up kind of wrapping duct tape around that character and preventing them from pursuing their own life. And this sounds absurd unless you're a writer. Characters will surprise us. Characters say things we did not know they were going to say. That's such an electric, exciting moment when that happens. I can't quite explain how that happens. And yes, if we treat our characters like, the whatever antique Barbie and Ken dolls that we don't want to take out of their boxes because they're too valuable in their perfection, we will hamper the story that could unfold if we let them cut loose a little bit.
It's a great analogy, yeah. So being too precious, you have your collection up there and you can show it, but you can't really do anything with it.
Right, yeah, you got to get the dolls out of the boxes and play with them. And that's the point of all of this character development, is to get to the place where we can now get them out and play with them and put the astronaut doll in the Gemini capsule and blast it off and see what happens. and let Barbie and Ken fight it out and see what happens. That's the play that happens when we get past all this character development and we actually start writing pages. And that's where the fun is. That's where the life comes. So character development is not an end in itself. The story is the end.
Chris, I heard you say in maybe a Michael Wiese video that a story is a hero's struggle against an obstacle to reach a goal.
Yes. So I first came across that quote from television writer Bill Idelson reading an article in the Writers Guild magazine. And I just have found that to be the E equals MC squared of the physics of storytelling. It gives us three elements. It gives us our hero, it gives us a goal, and then the obstacles against which the hero struggles. That's not everything that happens in story, but it allows us to understand at an elemental level what is happening in the story. So in Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, it's the story of Abraham Lincoln struggling against all of the forces of the U.S. House of Representatives who don't want to outlaw slavery, to pass an amendment to the United States Constitution outlawing slavery. Now, I didn't try. I just gave you the hero goal obstacle, but I gave you a log line for the movie. And the log line was just the hero goal obstacle dynamic put into a sentence. It brings the story into focus. It identifies the single action that Aristotle said that a drama needs to be about. And it puts the focus on the character's struggle. So if a story is the hero's struggle against an obstacle to reach a goal, then the story juice is in the struggle. And we want to spend most of our page count dramatizing that struggle. That gives us force and focus for a story. It helps us know what the story is, so we can judge what serves the story and what doesn't, what's a distraction. I just find it to be such a clarifying lens. A story is not only that, there's also Claudia Hunter Johnson wrote a great book called Crafting Short Screenplays That Connect. And she talks about the power of connection and disconnection between characters and how much emotion comes from connection. You can think about a touch, a kiss as a connection, or two characters whose eyes meet and they realize against all odds they're actually on the same side, or a disconnection, a betrayal. And just to say betrayal, we feel the emotion that goes with that. And then there are missed connections, near misses, longed for connections that never happen. All of that swirls around heroes struggling toward goals against obstacles. So I find that to be so useful when I'm figuring out the structure of a whole movie or the structure of an individual scene. We can think about even the sprawling 3 movies or 3 books of Lord of the Rings. It's all about Frodo carrying a ring to Mount Doom to destroy it, struggling against all the forces of Mordor. It's a single action across all 3 3-hour-long movies. And the filmmakers never lose sight of what the story is. The story is Frodo struggling against the forces of Mordor to destroy the ring. Lots of stuff happens in that movie. And we actually kind of feel the energy drain when we step away from that central thread. When we're with Merry and Pippin in the trees, we sort of feel the temperature turned down on the urgency and the focus of that. Tom Bombadil, which for readers of the book, they know there's maybe 100 pages about some guy named Tom Bombadil, has nothing to do with Frodo trying to get rid of that ring. And so rightly that just falls out of the movies because it doesn't serve the imperative of movies, which is all about what happens next. And hero goal obstacle helps us to know what we mean when we say, well, what happens next? Is what happens next as the hero struggling toward the goal.
And forgive me, you talked about this other movie, and is that Blood Diamond?
Yes.
Okay, and I have not seen it, but if I'm keeping with what I believe you said was sort of this premise, it seems like their common goal is this diamond or these diamond mines and having access to them.
Well, so in this case, we've got two protagonists. We've got Leonardo DiCaprio, whose goal is make all the money he can from these diamonds. And then Djimon Hounsou, whose goal is rescue my son. And so here we've got two stories that intersect. And so we could call that, I think Robert McKee calls that a multi-protagonist story, which is to say you've got multiple protagonists, each with their own goal, and they succeed or fail individually. You can also have buddy movies or movies with several people on a team all struggling toward the same goal, and they succeed or fail together. And McKee calls those plural protagonist movies. Plural protagonist movies are more of the classic structure that we see in, say, Hollywood movies. Multi-protagonist movies are more art house things. They're much harder to do. But you know those movies like Crash and Traffic and Magnolia. That's where you see, and Babel, multi-protagonist movies.
Sure.
And I think that's what's going on with Blood Diamond.
Right. And so the real goal, though, isn't this diamond. The real goal is the realization that this father loves his son and he's trying to save him from...
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. You've got sort of your stated goal. I'm going to rescue my son. I'm going to get that diamond. Some characters have the wrong goal, or their need for growth is far more important than their stated goal. Leonardo DiCaprio's goal, he's got the wrong goal. He just wants to be rich. He wants diamonds. That's the wrong goal. What he really needs to do is find something that is worth more than diamonds, and that's people, that's love. And he does. So the audience recognizes that, and they say, oh, you didn't get your goal, but you grew in the way you needed to, so I can still feel good about that. But if you die along the way, it's bittersweet, and so that's cool. You know, it's not the neat bow. Whereas Djimon Hounsou, the dad who's looking to rescue his son, it's not really a story about his inner growth. For him, we are invested in him actually achieving his goal of rescuing his son, which will require his son's transformation. So that's where we get the transformation and the emotion that accompanies that in that story. And those two end up being intertwined at the end, but they unfold independently for the first good part of that movie.
You said that mostly art house cinema does sort of like these multi-protagonist films.
Well, if you've got a multi-protagonist film, it is going to be probably less of a blockbuster. And so, yes, you may end up having an art house film if you do that. Mostly studio films are going to be the more classic single story that we're telling, whether with one protagonist or many working together. So like a multi or a plural protagonist story, a lot of protagonists working together would be the Ocean's 11, 12, 13 movies. You've got a team of people who are all trying to pull off the same heist, and they succeed or fail together.
Do villains have defining moments?
I think that they certainly can. Sometimes we get villains who are very cardboard cutout, just gleefully wreaking havoc for the heck of it. But I think of a classic film, Spider-Man 2, and there Doc Ock has a defining moment. He isn't evil for the sake of evil. He is a man who is wounded through the death of his wife. That's the moment that defines him. And in Spider-Man 2, written by the same writer who wrote Ordinary People, we get a villain who actually has an arc and who transforms, and in the end is able to take a step back from the evil and to actually sacrifice himself to join with Spider-Man and to save the city. So yes, I think that Spider-Man 2 plays a really important role in the history of superhero action films. We look back and we may not recognize that because we're used to superhero action films that have rich character development. But Spider-Man 2 really took that up a huge step by, in part, looking deeply into the character of their villain and by providing the depth and complexity and dimension that defining moments afforded that character.
And when we do see these defining moments for these villains, is it to have the audience turn to have some empathy toward that antagonist, or is it just to further understand sort of the arc of the story?
I think the effect is that we actually do have some empathy for that villain. And it's not to say that we like the villain or we agree with the evil the villain does, but it's to say that we recognize the villain's humanity. And we say, oh, you are at least a little bit like me. We are the same species. And there are a lot of different ways to approach villains. We can approach villains as other, just completely different from me and outside of me. But you think about Pinocchio. So if we go way back to a very disturbing children's animated film, a scene where Pinocchio is at the pool hall and he and the other boys are drinking and smoking cigars and playing pool and being transformed into donkeys. That's a vision of evil that says, oh, there is no difference between us and them. We are them. And that is a cautionary tale, but it also does lead to a kind of empathy where we can recognize, oh, that villain is really broken, and what they're doing may be horrible, and actually we may call it evil, but they are also one of us. And for my storytelling money, that's closer to what I resonate with as like, yeah, I think that's how it is.
How are the decisions of the villain different from the hero?
In many ways, the hero and villain's decisions are the same. They're driven by the way they see the world and what they want. When I am writing an antagonist, and I will often think in terms of antagonist as opposed to villain, because villain is more condemning than I think I'm ready to be with most of my characters. Joseph Mengele certainly was a villain and did pure evil, and he was a human, which is what made him so interesting to me as a character. What allowed us to write Joseph Mengele in a way that I think was so disturbing and ended up getting the actor Best Actor nomination for the European Film Award was that we approached him as a character who thought he was the hero. And I think that everyone sees themselves as the hero of their story. They do what they do for the reasons they do them. And even when they do something that they would recognize is like, okay, that was bad, but you have to understand, I had a really good justification why I had to do that. It's part of the genius of Michael Corleone's character. We understand with every choice he makes why he makes it. And we cringe because sometimes he's killing family members. But we always recognize the reasons that he does it. And it creates this cognitive dissonance for us because we're saying, "Ooh, no, that's like, you shouldn't do that." And at the same time, I totally understand why you just did that. I think that gives us really fascinating antagonists and villains if we do the same character development for them that we do for any other character. I don't think that means we have to have really fuzzy moral judgment. I think we can still recognize evil as evil and recognize the humanity of the people who are doing the evil at the same time. It's a more nuanced approach. I think it's more interesting, and I think it rings true to me for how people actually are. I don't think I've ever met a villain at Vaughn's. You know, I've met people doing dumb things and being irresponsible and uncaring, but they think they're right. And so I try to approach all my characters with love, even the ones that are wicked.
How do writers get audiences to care about the villains?
I think that on the one hand, you could get away with the audience not caring about the villains, even gleefully rooting for the destruction of the villain. But the example of Spider-Man 2 shows us that there is emotional gold to be mined in providing a glimpse into the humanity of a villain. So that in the same way that we would reveal a character, say a heroic character, to the audience so that they can understand where that character's coming from, we can use those same tools to reveal who this villain is and why this villain is, what journey this character has been on to arrive at their villainy. I think the emotional experience then becomes really complex, because now I recognize that character has to be stopped. I'm thinking of the camp commandant in Schindler's List, where we really do get some insights into this character, into his vulnerability, into there's a moment where he toys with showing mercy to people. And then he pulls back from that. It's like, that's not me. I'm not going to be that guy who is merciful. But the fact that he had that moment where he could have been merciful colors the way we feel about him when he's executed at the end of the film. It makes it more complicated in a way that I think enriches the experience. Never confuses us about the evil that he's perpetrated. The film never has any confusion about that the evil is evil. But it does show us the complexity of the person perpetrating the evil, which does, I think, make for a more interesting storytelling experience.
Do you have any practical exercises that writers can do for defining or redefining their characters?
I do, actually. So in the book, we approach practical exercises in a variety of different ways. So the first set of practical exercises has to do with walking writers through a discovery of their own defining moments. And that can be a pretty emotional thing to do, to go back and really touch those moments that have shaped us in wonderful ways and terrible ways. And then we also provide a set of exercises that walk a writer through discovering their character's defining moments. And those are very kind of practical, here's the thing to do now, set this much time on the timer and start writing and keep writing until the timer goes off. I'm a kind of a believer in what Anne Lamott talks about, small assignments, and in her book Bird by Bird. Writing can be really daunting because it's like running a marathon. It's just so much you can't imagine how much it is. And so starting can be really, really hard. Every day when I start writing, that's the hardest thing I do. It requires the most discipline. And once I've tipped over into writing, then I'm going. But it's like taking that first plunge into the cold swimming pool in the morning. You just kind of have to give yourself a push in the back. And these exercises are designed to say, all right, blank sheet of paper, pick up a pen, here's your prompt, now go. I find that when writers do that, they end up writing things they didn't mean to write. They uncover things they didn't know were there. And I really love it when we just start writing and require ourselves to keep the pen moving. Now, this is a very physical way to approach it. Apart from a keyboard, I think somehow there's some value in actually writing with a pen or pencil and paper. And so a prompt might be, think of your character, think of how they need to grow and change. Now, why have they not grown and changed in that way yet? Or think of the way your character's strength or their genius. When was the first time they realized that they had that strength or genius? Write about that for 5 minutes. And so you might start by writing, I'm not even sure, he knows how good he is at the trombone. And I'm not sure why he doesn't know or why he's playing the trombone in the first place. And then you eventually, if you just keep writing, you stumble upon something that you didn't know you were going to stumble upon. And what is it about the trombone that is just perfect for his personality? What's happening when he's playing the trombone? What is he feeling? And that's a really terrible example, but it shows how just doing exercises allows you to start finding these little starters that will lead to bigger things. One of the chapters, I think we start with the sentence, "Characters start at zero." Meaning, as the storyteller, I don't know anything about the character when they first pop into my mind. Nor does the audience know anything about a character just before they step on stage. And I will only know what I know about a character through what I discover about them. And the audience will only know about a character through what I reveal about them. So I have to somehow get myself to engage with this discovery process. And once I've mounded up all of this raw material, then I'm ready to start writing and doling that out in a strategic way as I tell the story. These exercises are designed to give writers and actors and directors practice thinking about and working with characters in this way so that all of us can make the discoveries that are going to make for rich and lifelike characters who can transform before our eyes.
When you mentioned Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, I believe the title, if I remember correctly, is based on a conversation she had with a grandfather or uncle, where you just take it a little bit at a time,
Yes.
bird by bird.
Yes, I think she had to write a report about birds, and she was looking out the window maybe at a flock of birds, and she was just overwhelmed. How am I going to do this? And I think her dad was a professional writer or professor, and he said, well, Anne, just take it bird by bird. And I think that's just some of the best advice for any writer.
How can an actor use defining moments to build their character?
Kathy and I interviewed several actors as we were writing this book because we really wanted to understand how these ideas could be useful to actors. We talked to two-time Emmy winner Tony Hale and talked to him about this, and he said, I have found that when I will dig into my own moments that have shaped me, defined me, the performance changes in a way that is appreciable. He had just come from recording a voice for an animated project. And he said, and I did that. I tapped into something that was really real and deep for me. And you could just tell the energy in the booth changed when I did that. And he said, I don't know why I don't do that all the time. I suppose it's costly emotionally to do that, but he absolutely recognized that by thinking about the single character that he's embodying and portraying, seeking to understand what are the moments that really have shaped and defined this character. How do those moments connect with my own life experience? He's able to infuse greater depth and complexity into those characters. And he said when he auditions, he seeks to bring himself in that way to the role. And he says, I may not, when I audition for that role, may not be the tallest or the this or that they're looking for, but I can guarantee that I will have delivered an audition that nobody else delivered, because they can't. They don't have access to his inner life. Only he does. That is the unique gold that he can mine and bring forward in auditions and performances. And I think any actor can benefit from that. And what I think is so useful for me as a writer and for actors is that we're talking about a limited number of things that we need to discover about the character. We don't have to know everything about every year of their lives. We just need to locate those moments that have most shaped them. And it gives us this deep understanding that gives all of us access in an empathetic way to the humanity of that character.
But possibly the actor could have a history in their back pocket, and it might lend to a heaviness here, a relief here.
Yeah, exactly. And that's for me as a writer, a really exciting thing. I'm collaborating with an actor to create this character. I do my part first, and then I pass the baton to the actor and the director, and they bring their resources, which are different from my resources. And when it all works the way we dream it will work, then you get this really rich character who does things that the writer never even imagined. And the actor has got to hope that the writer put on the page enough for them to work with, and then they can pick up that baton and carry it further.